In the winter of 532 AD, the city of Constantinople trembled. Not from foreign invasion, but from within. Snow clung to the marble roofs of the greatest city on earth, and beneath the cold, the empire's heart was beginning to overheat. For centuries, Rome's eastern capital had stood as a beacon of power and civilization, a fortress of gold and stone bridging Europe and Asia. Its walls had never fallen. Its markets overflowed with silk, spices, and stories from every shore of the known world. But by that fateful January, the glory of empire hid a deep sickness. Justinian I, Emperor of the Romans, sat on the throne of Constantine with the mind of a reformer and the ambition of a conqueror. He dreamed of restoring the lost western provinces, of reuniting the Roman world under one law, one church, one emperor. But dreams this large came at a price, and the people of Constantinople were the ones paying it. Heavy taxes crushed merchants and artisans. Grain prices soared. The gap between the palace and the streets widened like a fault line waiting to split. The emperor's ministers, men like John the Cappadocian and Trebonian, were feared more than loved, symbols of greed and corruption, who drained the empire's treasury by draining its citizens. The air was thick with resentment. In taverns and workshops in the alleys of the great city, whispers spread. The emperor builds churches for God and ruins for men. But if there was one place where every passion of Constantinople came to life, it was the Hippodrome, the beating heart of the Byzantine world. It wasn't just an arena. It was politics, religion, and identity woven into spectacle. Two rival factions dominated its stands, the Blues and the Greens. What began as chariot teams had become something far larger. Armed fraternities, street gangs, and political movements, each with thousands of followers ready to fight, bleed, and die for their colour. To the untrained eye, it was sport. To the people of Constantinople, it was war by other means. A victory for the Blues or the Greens wasn't merely entertainment, it was justice, honour, revenge. Their cheers could shake the throne. Their riots could burn the city, and they had burned it before. Justinian had once been a proud Blue, but as emperor he tried to balance both sides, and in doing so satisfied neither. The Blues felt betrayed by his leniency toward their rivals. The Greens despised his taxes and his heavy hand. The Hippodrome, once his stage of triumph, was now a volcano ready to erupt beneath him. Still, life in the empire went on. Every morning the muezzin's call of merchants echoed through the city's markets. Ships glided through the Golden Horn. The clatter of construction filled the skyline as Justinian poured fortunes into building projects, basilicas, fortifications, aqueducts, monuments to his vision of divine rule, the crown jewel among them, a grand new church of Hagia Sophia, holy wisdom, that would stand taller than any before, a temple meant to touch heaven itself. But as workers raised its arches, the city's faith in Justinian was collapsing. The old elite resented his rise from humble origins, the poor cursed his taxes, and the factions, the restless fanatical Blues and Greens, had begun to turn their fury not against each other, but toward the emperor himself. Early in January, the first spark caught. A few condemned men, members of both factions, were sentenced to hang for murder after a violent brawl. But when the gallows failed to work properly, two of the prisoners escaped and took refuge in a nearby church. Crowds gathered outside demanding pardon. Justinian refused. That small act of defiance, just a handful of men and a broken execution, became the match that would ignite the city. When race day came on January 13th, the Hippodrome overflowed. Tens of thousands filled the stands shouting their usual chants for their teams. But as the chariots thundered down the track, something changed. The Greens and the Blues, enemies for generations, suddenly began to chant the same word. One voice at first, then another, until it became a storm. "Nika! Nika! Conquer!" The emperor watched from his imperial box as the crowd turned from sport to revolution. The noise was deafening. Stones flew. Soldiers moved to protect the palace gates. And Justinian, the man who dreamed of rebuilding the Roman world, now faced the horrifying truth. He might not even be able to save his own city. Outside, the mob poured into the streets, the air filled with smoke and broken glass. The great city of Constantine, the jewel of the Mediterranean, was about to become a battlefield. The Nika Revolt had begun. The heart of Constantinople was not its palaces or cathedrals, it was the Hippodrome. Here, stone tiers curved around the thunder of chariot wheels, and 100,000 voices rose like a living storm. For centuries, this arena had been the empire's mirror, reflecting its glory, its madness, and its rage. On the surface, it was a place of sport. But within its walls, the empire's deepest divisions gathered under two colours, blue and green. The blues were the old guard, landowners, orthodox faithful, pillars of tradition. The greens were the restless masses, merchants, labourers, men who had nothing left but anger. Their rivalry went far beyond racing. It became a struggle between order and rebellion, between those who ruled and those who endured the cost. When Emperor Justinian took the throne in 527, he inherited this powder keg. He was a man of vast ambition, determined to restore the empire's lost greatness, to make Constantinople the new Rome. But ambition without empathy breeds distance. And from the marble halls of his palace, Justinian looked down at the factions not as citizens, but as a problem to be solved. The city's streets were already restless. Years of heavy taxation, corruption and inflation had turned loyalty brittle. The factions' brawls spilled out from the Hippodrome into markets and alleyways, each riot leaving blood on the stones. Yet instead of calming the tension, Justinian fed it. He favoured the blues, hoping their loyalty would steady his rule, a decision that alienated half the capital. Then came 531. A violent street clash led to multiple arrests from both factions. 7 men were condemned to die. Public execution as imperial warning. It should have ended there, but fate and human error intervened. 2 of the prisoners escaped the gallows and fled into a nearby church. The church became their sanctuary, but also a symbol. Outside, crowds gathered, not as blues or greens, but as citizens demanding mercy. For days they shouted for pardon, for clemency, for the emperor to show humanity. But Justinian's court remained silent. His officials saw rebellion where the people saw justice. Then came the next race day. The emperor took his seat in the imperial box, surrounded by the roar of the crowd. At first, the chants were the usual, cheers for the teams, cries for victory. But then the voices began to merge, rising from every corner of the arena. The blues and the greens, rivals sworn to destroy each other, were now shouting together. The sound rolled through the air like thunder. No one in Constantinople had ever heard such unity. It was more than protest, it was transformation. The factions had become a single force, furious, unpredictable, unstoppable. In that moment, the fragile order of the empire snapped. The arena that once celebrated imperial grandeur became the cradle of insurrection. Stones flew, fires were lit, and the streets beyond the Hippodrome caught flame. What began as a plea for mercy was turning into a revolution. Constantinople, the most magnificent city on earth, was about to burn, and the emperor who dreamed of rebuilding Rome would soon find himself fighting to save his own throne. The city of Constantine had seen riots before, but never like this. The Hippodrome's roar spilled into the streets, transforming cheering voices into a hurricane of rage. Torches lit the night as tens of thousands surged toward the heart of the empire. The chant of the crowd became a single living sound, not a call for sport but for vengeance. The flames began near the old prison. By dawn, the fire had leapt across the city like a predator unchained. Wooden homes crackled and collapsed. Roofs caved in under waves of heat. From the seawalls to the Augustaion, Constantinople burned. The sky turned black with smoke. The smell of pitch, ash, and flesh mingled into a suffocating fog. In the great palace, Justinian watched from his windows as chaos spread through the capital he had sworn to civilize. The Hippodrome, once the pride of the empire, had become the enemy's fortress. Inside, the mob chanted for a new emperor. The factions that had once fought each other now stood shoulder to shoulder against him. Their leaders declared that Justinian was no longer worthy to rule. For 5 days, the city belonged to the rioters. Government offices were ransacked, prisons were opened, criminals roamed free. The ancient Senate, terrified and powerless, bent with the wind. Even soldiers in the streets hesitated, uncertain whom to obey. The fires consumed more than buildings. They devoured symbols. The Hagia Sophia, the city's greatest cathedral, collapsed in smoke and ruin. The city's spiritual heart was gone, reduced to ash beneath a choking sky. Statues of emperors, some standing since the time of Constantine himself, were dragged down and shattered by the mob. What had begun as protest was now an apocalypse. As the days stretched on, Justinian's rule seemed to vanish like smoke through his fingers. Whispers spread that he had lost divine favour, that God had turned against him. Inside the palace, panic took hold. His ministers urged him to flee, to escape across the Bosporus and rebuild power in another province. To them, Constantinople was lost, but not everyone in the palace believed the empire was doomed. Among those urging Justinian to stand his ground was a voice he trusted more than any other, his wife, Empress Theodora. Born to the world of the Hippodrome, she understood the mob better than any court advisor ever could. And while generals and nobles trembled, she remained unflinching. When the council debated escape, Theodora rose and spoke, her words calm, sharp, and immortal. "Royalty is a fine burial shroud. If flight were our only hope, I would not choose to live. He who has worn the crown should never survive its loss." The room fell silent. Her defiance cut through the fear that had paralysed the court. In that moment, Theodora's courage became the empire's anchor. If the emperor's will had faltered, hers reignited it. Justinian resolved to fight. But the city outside was a nightmare. The rebels had appointed a new emperor, Hypatius, nephew of the old ruler Anastasius, dragged from his home and crowned in the Hippodrome. Tens of thousands filled the stands chanting his name, believing the empire had changed hands. The true emperor now faced a terrible choice: surrender the throne or take it back in blood. And for Justinian, mercy was no longer an option. His empire was burning, his authority mocked, his name defied. What came next would be remembered not as a battle, but as a slaughter. Theodora had refused to flee. Now Justinian would refuse to forgive. The city had fallen silent, not with peace, but with exhaustion. After nearly a week of fire and chaos, Constantinople lay in ruins. Smoke still coiled above the skyline where churches and forums once stood. Half the city had burned. Tens of thousands were dead or homeless. And inside the great palace, the emperor who had once ruled the world's greatest city now ruled little more than ashes. But Justinian had made his choice. He would not run. Theodora's words had bound him to his throne. To flee would mean the death of everything he had built, his power, his legacy, his Rome. So he chose a different path. If mercy had failed, then terror would rule. The emperor turned to two men who had never failed him in battle, Belisarius and Mundus. Belisarius, the young general who had crushed Persia's armies in the east. Mundus, the hardened commander from the Danube frontier, whose loyalty was iron. To them Justinian gave a single command: end the revolt no matter the cost. Outside, the mob filled the Hippodrome once more. They believed victory was theirs. Hypatius, their chosen emperor, sat in the imperial box crowned with the same gold that once rested on Justinian's brow. The people cheered his name, unaware that the true emperor's armies were already moving through the burning streets. At dusk, the attack began. Belisarius led his men through the northern entrances of the Hippodrome, while Mundus's troops closed in from the west. The narrow tunnels that once echoed with the sound of chariot wheels now filled with the tramp of soldiers and the rattle of armour. No warning, no mercy. When the gates burst open, chaos returned. but this time it was deliberate. Belisarius's veterans, armoured and disciplined, advanced through the crowd like a blade through flesh. The people screamed, trapped in the stone arena that had once been their pride. The slaughter was methodical. There was nowhere to run, only walls, steel and terror. Mundus's men sealed the exits and joined the killing. Spears thrust into the mass of bodies. Arrows whistled from the stands. Men, women and children fell together. The Hippodrome floor ran red with blood, so much that later chroniclers claimed it formed rivers that carried corpses to the gates. Hypatius, the would-be emperor, was seized alive and dragged before Justinian. He begged for mercy, insisting he had never sought the crown. Justinian looked at him for a long time, his face unreadable. Then he ordered his execution, along with that of his brother Pompeius. Their bodies were thrown into the sea, erased from memory. By nightfall, the revolt was over. The mob was gone, the factions silenced. 30,000 men and women, citizens of Constantinople, lay dead in the Hippodrome. The empire had been saved through annihilation. The next morning, smoke still rose from the ruins. Justinian stood before the remnants of his city, the air thick with the scent of death and ash. He had survived the greatest rebellion in Roman history, but the cost was beyond reckoning. The Nika Revolt had nearly destroyed him, yet in crushing it, he proved something the world would never forget, that his empire, like its ruler, would endure fire before it ever bent the knee. The blood of the Hippodrome marked a turning point. From its ashes, Justinian would rebuild, not only his city but his vision of empire, and the first stone of that rebirth would rise from the very ruins the riot had left behind. When the last embers cooled, Constantinople was a graveyard of stone. Entire districts lay blackened, their streets lined with the charred skeletons of homes. The Hippodrome, once the empire's heartbeat, was silent, its sand still dark with blood. For most rulers, such ruin would have marked the end. For Justinian, it became the beginning. He had stared into the abyss and lived. Now he would fill that void with monuments to power so vast that no one would ever again dare challenge the throne. The Nika Revolt had tried to erase him. He would answer by remaking the city itself. Reconstruction began within days. Thousands of labourers, artisans and architects flooded into the capital. The clang of hammers and the rhythm of chisels replaced the cries of revolt. Under imperial decree, new roads, markets and forums rose where ashes still smouldered, but one vision towered above them all, a church unlike anything the world had ever seen. The old Hagia Sophia, burned to ruin during the riots, would be reborn. Justinian vowed that its replacement would outshine every temple ever raised in Rome or Greece. To achieve it, he summoned two geniuses, Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus, mathematicians as much as architects. Their designs defied precedent. Instead of heavy walls, they imagined a structure that seemed to float, a vast dome suspended between earth and heaven. Work began in February 532, barely weeks after the slaughter. As the city mourned, masons carved marble, engineers hoisted columns, and artists gilded mosaics that would capture the light of eternity. Supplies poured in from every corner of the empire. Porphyry from Egypt, green marble from Thessaly, gold and silver from imperial treasuries. The same city that had once howled for Justinian's death now laboured under his vision. For 5 years the work continued, relentless, miraculous. When at last the dome was set, it rose 180 feet above the ground, glittering like the firmament itself. When sunlight passed through its 40 windows, the light scattered and shimmered across the marble, as if the heavens had descended into the church. On December 27th, 537, Justinian entered the completed Hagia Sophia for the first time. He looked up at the golden vault and spoke the words chroniclers would never forget. "Solomon, I have surpassed thee." In that moment, the emperor who had nearly lost his throne reclaimed his destiny. The same hands that had burned the city had, by his will, built a monument that would stand for 1,000 years. Yet Hagia Sophia was more than stone. It was Justinian's answer to rebellion, a symbol that divine order had triumphed over chaos. Its dome seemed to hover on light alone, a silent proclamation that heaven still favoured Rome, and every citizen who entered its vast nave could feel it. The empire had survived, transformed by fire but unbroken. From the ashes of the Nika Revolt, Justinian forged a legacy that would outlast kingdoms. He would go on to codify Roman law, reclaim lost provinces, and dream of restoring the Mediterranean to imperial rule. But none of his victories would ever match this one. The triumph over his own city, his own fear, his own fall. The Nika Revolt had begun as a cry of rage. It ended as a cathedral, and through that transformation the empire announced to the world that even when Constantinople burned, Rome did not die. It reinvented itself, in marble and light. When the smoke finally lifted from Constantinople, the empire that had nearly died was reborn, harder, sharper, and more absolute than before. The Nika Revolt had started as the roar of the people. It ended as the silence of imperial power. For Justinian, the blood spilled in the Hippodrome was not a stain. It was a warning to all who might challenge him. From that day forward, his rule would rest not on popularity, but on fear and divine authority. He had seen the abyss and survived it. The emperor who nearly fled his own palace now claimed to rule by the will of God. And yet beneath that triumph lay a paradox. The same revolt that secured his throne also revealed its fragility. For all its splendour, Constantinople had trembled, not before Persians or barbarians, but before its own people. The Nika riots proved that Rome's greatest enemy was never at its gates, it was always within. But from the ashes, Justinian built a legacy meant to defy that truth. The Hagia Sophia became more than a church. It was a monument to endurance, to divine order restored after chaos. Its vast dome still seems to float like heaven's answer to rebellion, a symbol that faith and empire could rise above ruin. And in that shimmering stone, Justinian found what he had nearly lost: legitimacy. His empire would endure for another 9 centuries, and the shadow of the Nika Revolt would haunt every emperor who followed. Each learned the same hard truth: rule from strength, or lose everything. In the end, the Nika Revolt was not just a riot. It was a crucible, where the Eastern Roman Empire shed its ancient skin and emerged as something new: the Byzantine world, an empire of faith, fear, and order. And so, from the screams of Nika to the silence of the rebuilt city, Constantinople's story became eternal. Fire tested Rome, and from that fire a different kind of Rome survived.